He mihi nunui ki a Ngāti Kauna, nōna te whenua o Kauna Tantania. Rau ko kaitahu, nōna te whenua e noho nei au I Naia nei. I'd like to acknowledge the Kaurna people of Adelaide, whose lands I would have been standing on to speak, and kaitahu, people whose lands I'm on right now. I'll just get the...
You just hit the share screen.
Sorry. He mihi nunui hoki ki te rōpu whakahaere mō tā koutou tono kia tuku kōrero au ki a koutou. My thanks also to the BSANZ people for inviting me to speak today. Kia koutou e matakitaki ana tēnā koutou. Well, looking at the call for papers and the suggested topics, I was very excited and thought, gosh, I could speak for 30 minutes on any one of these. So this talk will actually be a little broad and touching on a number of those listed topics. And my hope is that it stimulates a bit of discussion. I'm talking about Niupepa Māori, historical Māori-language newspapers, an area where I've done most of my research, and I'll hopefully show why they are important. There are a lot of New Zealanders who know nothing about these publications, so I don't imagine that many Australians will have even heard of them. So I'm going to start off with some general contextual information on Māori language print and periodicals. I'll then go on to discuss how the Niupepa can be important to language learning and linguistic research. Then I'm going to finish off with looking at some selected excerpts from these papers to show how these sources can provide understandings of New Zealand history and how they can add texture to what we already know, but mostly to show how they can reveal indigenous Māori voices, their opinions, their agency that would not have otherwise been recorded. So New Zealand has one of the largest repositories of indigenous printed and manuscript material in Australasia and Oceania. The only other comparable place is Hawai'i. The sheer volume of material is truly impressive. Now, if we look at this authoritative books in Māori, we'll see over 1,500 one-off print publications and 48 periodicals, some of which had hundreds of issues. And this doesn't include manuscript materials, some of which have been published more recently. Of course, printing in Te Reo Māori did not stop in 1900. And if a volume for the 20th century is ever attempted, it'd be different, but I am sure just as weighty. Why so much stuff? And why is this different to other places, such as the Australian colonies? First, there is just one Māori language. Yes, there are some dialectical differences, but these are not significant enough to impede intelligibility. In the early 19th century, Protestant missionaries saw Māori as suitable subjects for conversion to Christianity and Western modernity. They believed that every convert should be able to read the Bible in their own language, which in turn led to substantial printing of scriptures. That the missionaries preceded colonization is also significant. They developed an orthography and were teaching, preaching, and printing in Te Reo Māori for a quarter century before formal colonization had begun. Māori took up literacy with enthusiasm, and this happened in a number of Polynesian societies, and they used writing and later printing for their own social and political purposes. So a combination of missionary aspiration, Māori enthusiasm saw text permeate Māori society. For example, Peter Lynham estimates that during the 1830s and 40s, missionaries sold or gave away one copy of the New Testament for every 2 Māori people. At this time, the humanitarian movement had a huge impact in Britain, leading to Māori becoming British subjects under the Treaty of Waitangi. As Māori Stevens has asserted, Te Reo Māori was used as a civic language, not just between Māori, but as a means of communication between Māori and the government. Of course, it was the government's aim for Māori children to learn English. But this only had variable success in the 19th century. Bilingualism was increasing in the 20th century, but there was still a need for Māori language texts well into the 1950s. When contemplating publishing, it's not unreasonable to think of the connection of textual output to the capitalist system. Publishers surely produce books, newspapers, and magazines to make money. One thing to remember is this was seldom the case for Māori language publishing. The market was generally too small, too poor, and too dispersed. Editors and writers worked for free or part of other work. And publications normally didn't last long enough without the church, the state, or a wealthy benefactor to sustain them. Now we can see from this simplified diagram that I've made up that it didn't stop people from trying. Some newspaper flopped after 1 or 2 issues. But let's look at first of the religious papers, Te Haiata, which is up on the left, which was put out on a monthly basis by a Wesleyan missionary between 1859 and 1862. It represents 36 issues or about 144 pages. If we go down to the bottom middle, we'll see Te Puki ki Hukarangi, which was financed by Hamuera Mahupuku, a wealthy landowner. And it had the longest span of any independently run Māori paper, almost 180 issues of 4, 6, or 8 pages between 1897 and 1913. Money was not the object, wasn't the motive. Neither was up-to-date news a primary goal. Controllers were more concerned with their social, political, and religious agenda. For example, the government was trying to amalgamate Māori into the colonial state and its institutions. Its longest running publication was not strictly speaking a newspaper. Te Kahiti, which ran from 1863 to 1931, was the Māori equivalent of the official government gazette, but it advertised native land court sittings and other government notices. Missionary and church publications were trying to convert and civilize Māori. The Anglican papers, in yellow there, were aligned to the Young Māori Party, and they sought to uplift Māori socially, intellectually, and materially, as well as spiritually. Other Māori-run papers were often also interested in the improvement of Māori, but at times attempted to subvert or critique colonial discourses, or provide an outlet for discussion on Māori politics. Looks like we've jumped one. There we go. Like a lot of Indigenous material, Niupepa can easily be lost or hidden, or just take some effort to find. So I should mention that graph that I showed, I've had to add to several times. For example, I came across these 2 publications from 1917 and 1932, just in the last few months in the Auckland War Memorial Museum. And I recently found the Mormons' Te Karere on several of the church's websites. These Niupepa Māori span a period of incredible cultural change. So I hope that people can see that they are a diverse and complex set of sources. But why are they important? First, print culture and print history are interesting in themselves. This is not something that I need to explain to a crowd like this. But my interest has always been less about the physical object and more about the actual messages and texts being promulgated and how they were received. I'm also a language teacher, and I like to use authentic texts from the past to illustrate examples of grammar, as in these examples from Māori-run newspapers. So this is a slide from one of my lectures. Teaching the use of the verb tai to express the notion of extending to a certain point in time or place. I do, of course, construct my own examples, especially to cater for the less advanced learners. But the people whose words are printed in the Niupepa Māori were either first language speakers, and particularly in the 19th century, perhaps spoke English little at all, or they were Pākehā missionaries and government officials who spoke very fluently. So the texts have a certain authenticity and are excellent to challenge my better students. The newspapers are, of course, also a treasure trove for linguists. When I was a graduate student, I was a researcher in a project compiling a list of loanwords in Te Reo Māori. The example here is from a letter from a Māori man to the Premier. And what we can see is that as Māori were confronted by the realities of colonialism and modernity, they incorporated many loanwords into their own language, mainly from English. Of course, this trend had started with the missionary Bible translation, but the newspapers show that over the course of the 19th century and first half of the 20th, thousands of words migrated into Te Reo Māori. In more recent times, some scholars have denigrated the overuse of loans and have sought to create neologisms from more indigenous-based words or revive older words that were no longer commonly used. I'm currently doing research with one of my colleagues, Dr. Gianna Leone, on the emergence of the word Panoni, meaning to change. William Williams included the word in his first dictionary in 1844, meaning to change as the name, perhaps alluding to the Māori custom of changing one's name to mark specific events. The word remained in the various editions of the dictionary, and by the 1957 edition was now defined as a transitive verb. Now, there are many different and authentic ways in Te Reo Māori to express the notion of change. But in the 20th century, the word tini, a loan from the English word change, was increasingly being used. In the 1990s, the word panoni was reintroduced by the Māori Language Commission and by language experts such as Te Panikiritanga, an elite training centre for fluent speakers, perhaps in reaction to the widespread use of the loan. The Ministry of Education also lists the term within its Māori immersion curricula for maths and science. Other dictionaries that had not previously included the term have now started to do so. So while many older speakers have never heard of the word panoni, its use is now spreading amongst young people as the primary term to express the notion of change, used both transitively and intransitively. Now, one of the real advantages of digitization is that one can look rapidly through whole corpora of print matter to see how and how often a particular word is used. What we found was that the word does not appear in the Māori Bible, nor in any of the Māori language newspapers that are online, nor any government documents in Te Reo Māori, While the non-occurrence in digitized text doesn't prove that the word Panoni didn't exist, it does show that its inclusion into Williams' dictionary may have been an error or just persisted over time, or that it was a rarely used dialectical expression. So I think what we can see here is that Niupepa can be a valuable tool in language revitalization authenticity. With this letter excerpt, we can see the oral nature of early Māori writing. The name of the government newspaper, Te Manuhiri Tuarangi, means guest from afar. Indeed, the writer, Niupepa Terangi, is imagining himself in the metaphor, standing on the marae, welcoming the newspaper as if it's a person. Terangi even finishes his speech with a waiata, a song, just as Māori orators do today. So we can deduce that he is skilled in oratory, and we can see references to the political situation and his assertion of his affection for the governor. But while literate, he probably didn't have an extensive mission education. Linguists can compare this to later Māori writings and we'll see a marked change away from oral expression in writing to the more structured styles that are taught in schools. So as part of the larger collection of print and manuscript sources, I think we can see that Niupepa can be immensely useful in terms of language research, language authenticity, and linguistic research. That's the waiata. Until recently, New Zealand historians relied largely on English language materials, often sourced from archives that privileged state and Pākehā collecting. We know that the newspaper content can be incredibly wide, encompassing politics as well as economic, religious, social, sporting, and cultural activities. The historical Niupepa are therefore hugely valuable in providing a window on the past that has the potential to disrupt orthodoxies and allow for interesting revisions of historical understandings. But in particular, they provide a platform for the voice of indigenous people that might not have made it into the traditional archive. For the remainder of my talk, I'll present a series of vignettes that illustrate what I mean. The masthead of Te Karereo Poniki bears the royal coat of arms. So we might assume that it's a government publication. But although Walter Buller, its editor, was a government interpreter, he ran it as an independent project. Now that's the earliest picture I could find of him in his early 30s. But actually, he was not quite 19 when he started this newspaper. Buller was the son of a Wesleyan missionary, which also impacted the style and the content of his newspaper, which aimed at social improvement and engagement with modernity. What is significant about this paper is the amount of space allowed for Māori correspondence. So not counting advertising, there were about 481 items printed in the 54 existing issues, of which 261, or about 54%, are letters written in by Māori, some of which looked forward to the benefits of the new colonial order, while others critiqued it. In this excerpt, we see Heremia Te Tuere criticising the government's practice of trying to entice individual chiefs into selling land. Government policy at the time acknowledged that the land was communal and that all the people of the iwi were meant to be consulted. But its land agents used underhanded tricks that in turn led to bloodshed within and between competing iwi. This is just one of a number of letters arguing against the selling of land. We can see this excerpt from Niupepa Terangi, a description of how landless Māori end up reduced to selling firewood to Pākehā to make ends meet. It's an interesting piece as he introduces a sort of pidgin language that some Māori and Pākehā may have used when trading. Haumate, how much? Tirikapa, 3 coppers, or 3 pence. But his point was that selling land usually meant a drift into poverty, whereas cultivating it for oneself allowed for ongoing prosperity. As he also stated, perhaps soon it will be the high tide. What I mean by that is the multitude of Pākehā, and we, the Māori, will be like the seagull cracking shellfish on the beach. It was a constant refrain from missionaries and officials that Māori needed to be more like Pākehā in terms of clothing, housing, schooling, work, and faith. However, if Māori were seen to be trying but failing, or putting on airs, or just not adapting in the way desired, this was also a cause for Pākehā criticism. In Te Karere o Pōneke, the Reverend Thomas Hutton wrote a number of adaptations of Aesop's fables as a means of critiquing Māori behaviour. Using the fable of the dog and his reflection, he disparaged Māori travelling to the Nelson goldfields to try their luck. This struck a nerve with the local chief, Henare Te Puni, who wrote in with a report of how several men had recovered 9 pounds 2 ounces of gold, but he directly critiques Hutton's fable and expresses his distaste for the denigration of Māori. So despite Te Karere o Pōneke being a Pākehā-run paper, its liberal policy on Māori correspondence allowed a range of Māori voices and opinions. The first Māori-run paper was the most anti-government and radical. It was edited by Paterson on behalf of the Kingitanga, or Māori King movement. Its primary goals were to provide a counter-propaganda to the government's discourses and to repudiate the British claim to rule, and to promote the notion of a Māori-run state within New Zealand. In the first 25 years or so, the government based its legitimacy on the 1840 Treaty of Waitangi, portraying the treaty in terms of a covenant, an expression Māori understood in terms of its religious significance. In this excerpt, critiquing the treaty, Te Hokioi first points out that many chiefs, even whole iwi, did not sign the treaty and therefore should not be bound by it. But its second objection was that Māori who did sign it did so out of ignorance. The article then employs a metaphor of a man offering dog some food. The dog eagerly gobbles it down. However, a bone gets stuck in his throat, and it is the man who has to extract the bone so the dog can live. Māori were not in a position to know how colonialism might pan out. So according to the paper, it was the government who knew what was going to be happening in 1840 who were at fault, not Māori. The issue for the Kingitanga was the government's assertion of its sovereignty. The governor was preparing for war, acquiring gunboats that could penetrate the Kingitanga's territories through the Waikato River. Te Hokioi argues that the gunboats were designed to intimidate Māori, that it was fine for Māori and Pākehā to use the river for trading purposes, but they had never agreed to open it up to government steamers. The paper then references the treaty. In the Māori translation of the treaty, chiefly authority over unsold land and property remained with the Māori owners. On this basis, the kingitanga assumed the mana, that is the power and authority, over the Waikato River. And Te Hokioi was asserting Māori sovereignty over Māori lands. However, the kingitanga was defeated militarily in 1864. The government confiscated its Waikato lands, and the king and many of his followers were forced into exile before finally making peace with the government in 1881. It was not until the 1890s that the movement, the kingitanga, resumed publishing a periodical of its own, and then only intermittently. What we can see from this impressive masthead is that although now peacefully coexisting with the colonial state, the kingitanga was still asserting an independent Māori authority. So I want to jump back just a few years to the 1870s. By this stage, the government had instituted the Native Land Court, which was efficiently extinguishing the native title on land so that it could be more easily sold off to Pākehā. The system was expensive for Māori and was rife with fraud and inequity, with Māori being ripped off by unethical shopkeepers, land agents, and wealthy capitalists. The repudiation movement sought to overturn these dodgy land deals in the Hawke's Bay province, and it engaged in an ideological battle with the government's newspaper, Te Waka Mori or Niupepa, under the control of the native minister, Sir Donald Maclean, a man who had become quite wealthy himself through his dealings in Māori land. So Te Wānanga was financed by a wealthy Ngāti Kahungunu chief, Henare Tomoana, a man who had actually fought alongside the Crown in the final years of the New Zealand Wars. The piece I want to look at from this newspaper is a personal notice from Tahapuku, a prominent chief seeking to protect a lake near his settlement at Te Hauki. He had no doubt seen what had happened to other wetlands that had been drained with the loss of traditional foods. He states that he doesn't want the property to go through the Native Land Court with all its expenses, but to retain its ancestral native title. Tahapuku was therefore asserting his ownership and mana over the lake for then and for the future. His notices in Te Wānanga became a permanent record of his wishes. And I thought, golly, does this lake still exist? Well, it does. And it looks as if Tahapuku's notice may have protected it from the actions of people, but not from the actions of God. It was larger and deeper in the past, but was partially drained naturally due to the Napier earthquake of 1931. The last person I want to talk about is Niupepa Terangi, an extremely wealthy and colourful Ngāti Kahungunu woman who owned extensive property, motor cars, and racehorses. As an important chief in her own right, she was also a leader within the Kotahitanga movement that established a Māori parliament in the 1890s. Her involvement in Niupepa spans several titles. First, as a co-editor of the ladies' column on the left within Te Tupiri, a newspaper published in Whanganui. But she also contributed to the newspaper of her uncle, Hamuera Mahupuku. And when he died in 1904, she and other women relatives continued to produce Te Puke ki Hukarangi until 1913. She wrote on many topics, especially politics, but it's a slightly different thing that I want to finish on. Whakapapa, or genealogy, is fundamental to Māori identity. It's what ties people to places and history and to other people, and further back to nature and the divine. However, it is also the basis of people's claims to land in the native land court. In a more traditional settings, whakapapa is recounted, recited as a means of either asserting one's chiefly heritage or to connect one group of people with another. But in the court, it was often used as a weapon to exclude other people and to increase one's own share of a block of land. So whakapapa was no mere whimsical interest in one's family tree. It could be the means to status, property, and money. Indeed, Niniwa's great wealth derived from native land court awards, and she frequently attended its hearings. So what we can see here is her trying to control the process, perhaps partly for her own benefit, but also to eliminate counterclaims within the court that could drag cases out and make things more expensive. So, to briefly wrap up, I hope first everyone can see from this little scratching at the surface that New Zealand scholars are extremely lucky to have so many Niupepa Māori, and these just a subset of an even bigger corpus of Māori language material. Second, that you have an appreciation of why they are important sources today for language learning and for linguistic and historical research. But for me, they are important because they are a repository from which Māori voices from the past may be heard again. Tēnā koutou.
Hello. Well, thank you, Lachy. It's been wonderful to hear that much anticipated talk from you. We've been sort of corresponding for quite some time now, I think. So it's lovely to actually to see you in person, or as it were, and and hear that fascinating talk. We've got questions, so please put your questions into the Q&A section. If you have questions for Lachy, type them into the Q&A rather than not the chat box, because we're using that for other purposes. We have a Q&A question already there, I think. Perhaps I'll read the questions out. Is that? Yeah.
Yep.
Anna Welch, our Vice President, says, thank you so much for this lecture. Given the potential for the newspapers to aid in language revitalisation, does any of the digitising work around them include audio readings of the texts?
Not that I'm aware of. Certainly, numbers of excerpts and bits and pieces have been printed in books, such as Letters to the Mountain, which were letters from Te Puke ki Hukarangi. But as yet, I'm not aware that people have done that. But that is, yeah, a really good suggestion.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yes, because hearing a language is just quite a different thing from just seeing it in transliteration, in print. I have just a little question, which is really more a comment. It's fascinating to see the differences, the way things played out between a different contact zones. Between different parts of Australia even and New Zealand, were there appreciable differences within New Zealand as well as from different parts of the island, or was it more or less?
Yes, and the thing is that across New Zealand, you've got a lot more Māori people, always have had a lot more Māori people living in the North Island. There was only one newspaper that was published in the South Island, and that was at the very top of the South Island, and it was a church newspaper. So no, there weren't newspapers produced in the South. They were produced in a number of different places in the North Island. So there isn't really sort of like huge differences. What you might, because also newspapers that might have been printed in one place tended to get sent to various other places. So, for example, that Te Karere o Pōneke, the 1850s newspaper from the Wellington district, most of the mail coming in from subscribers and readers was sort of generally from the bottom half of the North Island, but you got some that were right way over in the Chatham Islands. So that's some islands that are 700 miles off the coast of New Zealand. So Māori living there. And with the Te Wānanga newspaper, you have Māori that are living in the south of the South Island that are sending letters in. So it goes to show that, you know, these are getting sort of circulated around quite widely.
Yeah, great. I've got a question from Robert Fidian, who's from Flinders University. He's asking, who did the illustrations in these newspapers, and did any of it become regular editorial cartooning? And Robert works in Australian cartoons, so he's quite interested in that field. So, right. The Māori language newspapers, I don't think really had the cutting edge technology. So even when sort of machine-driven presses were being used for Pākehā newspapers, some Māori papers were still, you know, the old Albion style, you know, hand presses. And it's difficult to know who did some of the illustrations. Some of them may have been just stock images that were used in some newspapers. There, generally speaking, a lot of newspapers never had any illustrations. Those ones that made up the mastheads of newspapers, I'm not really sure. Possibly they were done professionally by somebody, you know, they said, well, can you do a picture like this? So, but no, there's no sort of history of cartooning within these newspapers. Right. Okay, well, it's another interesting difference, I suppose. But Anna has had another question. Anna Welch, she said the State Library of New South Wales has digitised a number of early Maori publications.
Okay.
And have you discovered these? She's got a link. She's got a link that she can send you. So
that would be great, because so are these on Trove or?
I think it's in the New South Wales, the State Library of New South Wales.
Okay.
Anyway, she maybe it's the best idea would be for her to email you a link afterwards, because that's fascinating. Thanks.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, okay. It's not Anna. It's a phantom Anna. There's a lot of people who are investigating Anna at the moment. Apparently, that's actually Maggie. So sorry, Maggie, but you're coming through as Anna. So if Maggie would like to perhaps contact, we've got Lochy's email is on the program. We have, with permission, put everyone's emails on the program, so that we can continue the conversation after the conference. You know, we can continue those private conversations. So that's what we would really like to do. We, you know, we really feel that there's so much more that goes on beyond the formal part of a conference, and we wanted to make opportunities for people to be able to talk to each other in a continuing way. So that's why we've given everyone's email addresses. We've got another question. Have we? Okay, I need to scroll down, don't I? Okay, so Nina. Yes, so Nina Whitaker has asked, was there ever any attempt by the government to ban Niupepa for their anti-government stance?
Surprisingly not. It was a fairly robust sort of debate that were in colonial newspapers in New Zealand at the time, including Māori ones, so things that would definitely be considered libelous now. There was only one major libel case, and that was taken against the government's own Māori-language newspaper. But the Kingitanga one, which was publishing the anti-government, quite radical stuff, basically it closed down because their land was invaded by the British Army. And the press ended up in a mud bank and was not discovered for sort of almost 100 years later, the frame of the press. So that you could argue that one was sort of closed down due to the government's invasion. Prior to that, there was a government newspaper. The government had a magistrate in the Kingitanga area, and he was publishing his own newspaper. He got basically told to desist or he would be killed. Māori came and seized his press. Eventually they gave it back to him and he left for Auckland. But that was the only one that was sort of forcibly closed down, and that was Māori closing down a government newspaper.
That's really interesting. Yeah. Susan Thomas has asked, are there many accounts of how these newspapers were read? For example, were they shared in group readings or were individuals reading them?
Particularly in the early days, they were read communally, and this is something that I've written on quite a bit. So there is an account of, this is very early on when the first government newspaper came out in the 1840s, where Māori would come to Auckland. They're probably Māori who lived in the general area, but they would come together, they would get the newspaper, it would be read out in a group, then they would all go back to their own places and write letters to the editor. There are lots of examples where Māori will, as a group, will be writing a letter saying, the newspaper came, we had a meeting, we read it out and discussed it, and this is what we think, and would send a letter back. So yeah, the mixture between sort of the oral communal kind of correspondent or sort of discourses and the textual ones sort of really combine and sort of not as separate as they are in sort of our modern way of thinking.
Yes, that's really interesting, isn't it? Sort of 19th century social media. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Are there any other questions? If you're having trouble typing them into the Q&A, you can put your hand up and we'll see if we can do it that way. But it might be. How are we going for time? We've still got time for another one or two questions. Yes.
Can I just say too that Māori society in the 19th century was certainly a lot less individualistic to the kind of life that people live nowadays. So it was quite common for sort of things just to be discussed openly, and that could be newspapers. There's also accounts of people writing letters, and that send somebody with the letter, and basically everywhere he stopped, people would open it up and have a read of it.
Right.
So yeah, it's sort of a different attitude, I guess, to privacy and
Yeah. And would they add something to the letter that when they opened?
I'm not sure about that, but
yes, I mean that sort of sounds almost like, you know, the mail, you know, the sort of social mail that you hear of from the sort of late 18th century, that
right,
where you wouldn't write anything in a letter unless you know you were happy for the whole family to hear it. yeah. Right. Okay. Well, if no one else has got any other questions right now, we can, as I say, please do feel free to keep the conversation going. You know, you can put things in the chat, you can put things in the Q&A, but probably the best way, if you want to talk to a particular person, is to actually email that person and ask them particular questions. You know, we'd also there's also the Facebook page for the conference, so we can. Oh, look, we've got another question. So right, perhaps before we go on, I'll put Tim White's question, which was in fact, I've got two more questions. One is from Tim White. He's curious as to the form of the newspapers. Did they use the same conventions as English language newspapers? Letters to the editors, social columns, and did they have an assimilation?
Yes, it depends. The thing is that the word Niupepa was basically any kind of periodical. So you might have something that was that size that might be called a Niupepa, and then you had other ones which looked much more like the early settlers ones with adverts on the front page and an editorial and various things like that. So yes, they did reflect sort of the settler newspapers, but also some were really what you might call a journal nowadays. Yeah.
And one last question from Merete Smith. How widespread was literacy?
Okay, so this is something that's really contentious.
Yes, right.
And because the missionaries very early on were saying, oh, look, we're having this marvelous success. Everyone's learning to read. And what happened too was as people Christianized, they freed their slaves. The slaves had learnt to read. They went back to their home areas. They taught people to read. So that missionaries would arrive somewhere for the first time and there'd be people that could read and write already. But having said that, if you look at a lot of the sort of examples where people have signed their names, it's not I don't think it's a great way of determining literacy, but you do still find lots of people who sign with an X. So that would indicate that their levels of literacy were very low. It's one of those things where you have people that argue for huge Māori literacy, and then other people who will argue that there's a lot less literacy than what people thought. For me, what's more important is that literacy is sort of seen as this two-stage thing. You're either illiterate or you're literate. It's really the literacy practices that are the important thing. How did people use that literacy? Did they use it communally? You know, what kinds of things did they have to read? They didn't have an awful lot of different things that they were able to read. So those are the things that are really more important to me than actual literacy, because I just don't think that you can really give a definitive answer on how literate Māori were in the 19th century.